The UNHS Compassion drifted silently through the blackness of space, its white hull gleaming under the distant starlight. Red crosses adorned its sides, visible from all angles, a universal symbol of healing and neutrality. The massive hospital ship had been designed to bring medical aid to the farthest reaches of human territory, and now it orbited the edge of the neutral zone between Earth's colonies and Krivak space. Dr. Alice Brown stared out from the observation deck, watching the slow turn of the blue-green planet below. Her reflection in the glass showed tired eyes and hair pulled back in a practical bun. 6 months into their humanitarian mission, and she had already overseen the treatment of thousands, both human colonists from frontier worlds and refugees from the recent civil conflicts in Krivak's territory. "Doctor, we've got another shuttle incoming. Burn victims from the mining accident on Helios Station," said Nurse John Clark as he approached with a tablet. His voice carried the slight drawl of someone raised in the American Midwest colonies. Alice nodded, taking the tablet and scanning the incoming patient list. "Prep surgery bays 3 through 6, and have someone contact Dr. Kim's team." John turned to leave but paused by one of the long-range scanner displays. He frowned slightly at the readings. "That's odd. There's movement in Sector 7. Patrol ships?" asked Alice. "Maybe. Pattern seems unusual, though." John shrugged. "I'll mention it to Captain Miller during shift change." Elsewhere on the massive vessel, Captain Susan Miller sat in her command chair reviewing supply requests. The Compassion wasn't a military vessel, but as its commander, she maintained the discipline and order necessary to run what was essentially a floating city of 3,000 medical personnel and patients. "Captain," called her communications officer, "we're receiving a distress signal. Civilian transport about 3 hours from our position at current speed. They're reporting engine failure and life support issues." Susan straightened in her chair. "Let me hear it." A crackling voice filled the bridge. "This is the transport vessel Horizon. We have 47 civilians aboard, and our main drive has failed. Life support systems functioning at 60% and declining. Any vessels in range, please respond. Plot an intercept course," Susan ordered immediately. "And inform Dr. Brown we may have incoming patients." Frank Taylor, the ship's diplomatic officer, approached her chair. "Captain, that would take us into the disputed sector," he said quietly. His face showed concern beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "The Compassion is protected under the Interstellar Medical Neutrality Act," Susan replied firmly. "We respond to all distress calls, regardless of territory. The Krivaks signed the same treaties we did." Frank nodded, but his worried expression remained. "The border disputes have been escalating. Just be careful." Susan smiled slightly. "We're a hospital ship, Frank. Who would attack doctors and patients?" 3 hours later, the Compassion approached the coordinates of the distress call. The massive white ship slowed as it entered the sector, its engines humming with decreased power. "I'm not detecting any transport vessel," reported the sensor officer, her fingers moving across her console. "Scanning for debris or escape pods." Captain Miller frowned. Something felt wrong. "Hail them again." "No response, Captain." Susan was about to order a more detailed scan when the tactical officer suddenly shouted, "Energy spike." 3 vessels decloaking off the port bow. The bridge crew watched in shock as 3 predatory shapes shimmered into existence just 5,000 meters away. The unmistakable dagger-like form of Krivak's warships. "Open a channel," Susan ordered urgently. "This is Captain Susan Miller of the UNHS Compassion. We are a non-combat medical vessel protected under interstellar law. Please state your intentions." Instead of a response, the lead Krivak ship fired a blinding purple beam that sliced across the Compassion's hull. "They're jamming our transmissions," the communications officer shouted over the sudden blare of alarms. Captain Miller stared in disbelief as the Krivak ships moved into attack formation. "Sound evacuation alarms. All patients to emergency shuttles." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "And may God help us all." The Compassion shuddered as another blast tore through its port side. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors in an eerie glow as medical staff rushed to evacuate patients. The ship had never been built for combat. Its hull was thin, designed to maximize internal space for medical facilities rather than withstand military weapons. "Move everyone from the burn unit first," Dr. Alice Brown shouted over the blaring alarms. Her white coat was stained with blood from helping a nurse who had fallen when the first blast hit. Priority to critical care in children. Around her, the medical bay descended into controlled chaos. Staff wheeled beds toward the escape pods, while others gathered essential medicines and portable equipment. A young doctor dropped to the floor as the ship rocked again, sending medical instruments scattering across the floor. In engineering, Peter Garcia worked frantically to reroute power to the failing life support systems. Sweat dripped from his face as he pulled himself through a narrow maintenance shaft. The ship's design schematics flashed through his mind. If the next hit breached the main oxygen distribution hub, hundreds would suffocate before they could reach the evacuation points. "Tim, I need to manually seal off Section 14. He called to his assistant through his communicator. "The automated systems are fried." "That's a suicide run, Pete," Tim replied, his voice breaking. "The whole area is depressurizing." Peter closed his eyes briefly. "There are 400 patients in the adjacent ward. Just tell my wife I love her, okay?" Without waiting for a response, he crawled deeper into the ship's innards. On the bridge, Captain Susan Miller fought to maintain control of her dying vessel. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the tactical display. "Any response to our broadcasts?" she demanded. "Negative, Captain," replied the communications officer. "They're blocking all frequencies." Susan slammed her fist on the console. "Keep trying. They have to know we're a hospital ship." The tactical officer looked up from his station, his face pale. "Captain, they're launching boarding craft." Susan stared at him in disbelief. This wasn't just an attack, it was an invasion. She reached for the ship-wide comm system. "All security personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. I repeat, prepare to repel boarders." Security Chief Lisa Martinez gathered her small team in the main armory. The Compassion carried only a minimal security detail, 20 officers whose primary duties involved managing the occasional unruly patient or protecting the ship's medical supplies. "Listen up," she told the grim-faced men and women before her. "We're not soldiers, but we're all that stands between these aliens and 3,000 patients and medical staff. Take defensive positions at these key junctions. Remember your training and buy the evacuation teams as much time as possible." They had just taken their positions when the first boarding craft latched onto the hull near the main surgical wing. The cutting tools of the Krivax made short work of the hospital ship's armor, and soon the first invaders poured in. The aliens moved with ruthless efficiency. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with gray-green skin and 4 arms, each carrying a different weapon, they fired without hesitation at anyone they encountered. Their breathing masks gave them an insect-like appearance that added to their terrifying presence. Dr. William Jones, a young resident barely 2 years out of medical school, huddled beneath a desk in the communications room. He had been sending messages to his family when the attack began and had watched in horror as the Krivax executed the communications officer right in front of him. With shaking hands, he reached for the emergency transmitter. The main communications array was destroyed, but the backup system might still reach the nearest Earth outpost. He composed a brief message, attached the ship's sensor logs showing the unprovoked attack, and hit send just as the door to the room slid open. A Krivax soldier stepped in, its 4 eyes scanning the seemingly empty room. William held his breath, praying the distress signal had gotten through. The motion detection equipment in the alien's helmet swiveled toward his hiding place, and William closed his eyes. His last thought was that someone needed to know what had happened here. Someone needed to make sure this attack didn't go unanswered. Admiral Carl Wright was in the middle of a Security Council meeting when his aide rushed in with a tablet. The young officer's face was pale, his hand slightly shaking as he handed the device to the Admiral. Wright's eyes narrowed as he read the fragmented message. For a moment, the conference room fell silent. "Excuse me," Wright said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We need to end this meeting now." 30 minutes later, in the Crisis Command Center beneath the United Nations headquarters, Wright stood before a wall of screens displaying satellite imagery. The wreckage of the Compassion floated in silent testament to the attack. Debris scattered across thousands of miles of space, along with what were clearly bodies. "Confirmation?" Wright asked, his weathered face set like stone. "Positive, sir," replied the officer beside him. "The transponder codes match. It's the Compassion. Initial estimates suggest over 3,000 casualties." Wright closed his eyes briefly. The Compassion had been the pride of Earth's humanitarian fleet. His own grandson had been treated on a similar hospital ship after a colony accident 2 years ago. "The distress call included sensor data," said Lieutenant Mary Davis, stepping forward. Her intelligence team had been analyzing the fragments of information sent by Dr. Jones. "The attack was deliberate, sir. The Krivax ships disabled communications first, then targeted life support and evacuation points." The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't a mistake or a rogue commander. This was something else entirely. "Put me through to the President," Wright ordered. Within hours, leaders from Earth's nations gathered in emergency session. Arguments erupted immediately. "We must respond with caution," urged the Chinese representative. "This could be a misunderstanding or the actions of extremists within their military." "Misunderstanding?" The Russian delegate's voice rose in disbelief. "They attacked a clearly marked hospital ship. This is a war crime by any definition." The UN Secretary-General raised his hands for quiet. "We need verification before we take any action that could lead to full-scale war." "Admiral Wright, what do your intelligence teams say?" Lieutenant Davis stepped forward, her uniform crisp despite having worked through the night. "Sir, we've analyzed the attack pattern and communications. This operation was coordinated and deliberate. Furthermore, we've intercepted Krivax military communications that suggest this attack was sanctioned by their high command." She hesitated before continuing. "There's more. Some escape pods launched successfully. The Krivax hunted them down one by one." A murmur of horror spread through the room. "One final piece of evidence," Davis said, tapping her tablet. The main screen changed to show security footage from inside the Compassion. The images were grainy but clear enough. Krivax soldiers methodically executing medical staff and shooting patients in their beds. The footage ended with a Krivax soldier firing directly at the camera. The Secretary-General's face had gone ashen. This cannot go unanswered. As the political leaders debated the appropriate response, something unexpected happened. The footage was leaked to the public. No one ever discovered the source, though many suspected Admiral Wright himself. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Memorials appeared outside hospitals worldwide. Military recruitment centers were flooded with volunteers. Production facilities that had been converted to civilian use after the peace treaty began retooling for military production without even waiting for government orders. The Krivax ambassador was summoned to the UN. His government's claim that the Compassion had been transporting weapons was met with cold silence. Evidence quickly proved this a lie. The hospital ship had been carrying nothing but medical supplies and a load of children's toys donated for refugee camps. Admiral Wright drafted the official response himself. It was delivered to the Krivax embassy by a junior officer, a deliberate insult in diplomatic terms. The message was simple: surrender those responsible for the attack on the UNHS Compassion within 7 Earth days, or face the consequences. The Krivax had mistaken humanity's desire for peace as weakness. They were about to learn how terrible a mistake that was. The 7 days passed with no response from the Krivax. On the morning of the 8th day, Admiral Wright ordered the activation of the 6th Fleet. For 5 years, the massive warships had floated silently in Earth's outer orbit, powered down and partially dismantled as part of the peace treaty. Now they hummed back to life, skeleton crews working around the clock to restore weapons systems and drive cores. Military transports rushed between Earth and the fleet, carrying supplies, personnel, and munitions that had been stored in underground bunkers. At the center of this renewed activity floated the U.S. Retribution, a dreadnought that had never seen combat. It had been under construction when the peace treaty was signed, and rather than scrap the nearly completed vessel, Earth's military had kept it in reserve, officially designated as a research platform. Admiral Wright stood on the Retribution's bridge, watching as technicians brought systems online. The ship was nearly twice the size of any previous human military vessel, its hull bristling with weapon ports that had remained sealed until now. "Status report," he ordered. "Ahead of schedule, Admiral," replied the shipyard commander. "We'll be combat ready in 72 hours instead of the projected week." Wright nodded. "And the special systems?" "Dr. Green has them at 90% operational capacity. She says they'll be ready by launch." In a separate part of the shipyard, Colonel Jack Freeman led his Special Forces team through another simulation. The men and women moved with practiced precision through a mock-up of a Krivax command ship, their movements fluid and lethal. "Faster," Freeman called out. "The Krivax have 4 arms. That means they can operate controls and weapons simultaneously. You need to be twice as fast to compensate." His team redoubled their efforts. Many had lost friends or family on the Compassion. All had volunteered for what might well be a suicide mission, boarding and capturing key Krivax vessels. Meanwhile, in a heavily guarded research facility, Dr. Elizabeth Green supervised the installation of new shield generators on a squadron of fighters. The technology had been developed years ago, but shelved during the peace negotiations. "The modulation needs to be faster," she told her team. "We know their weapons operate on a frequency of 419 terahertz. Our shields need to adapt within microseconds." One of her assistants looked up from his workstation. "Dr. Green, we've been working nonstop for 3 days. The team needs rest." Elizabeth's tired eyes hardened. "My sister was the chief pediatric surgeon on the Compassion. She doesn't get to rest. Neither do we." Across Earth and its colonies, similar scenes played out. Reserve units reported for duty without waiting for official recall notices. Mothballed defense systems were reactivated. Factories shifted production to military supplies with speed that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. The Krivax made diplomatic overtures, suddenly willing to discuss the unfortunate incident. But they refused the one demand that mattered: surrendering those responsible. Their ambassador suggested a small reparation payment instead, not understanding that no amount of money could satisfy humanity now. Other alien species, previously neutral or even friendly with the Krivax, began distancing themselves. The Vorten Confederation, known for their strict code of medical neutrality, publicly condemned the attack and offered humanity intelligence on Krivax fleet movements. In her modest apartment, Rebecca Miller stared at the photo of her wife, Captain Susan Miller. The official notification of Susan's death had arrived 3 days ago. Today, Rebecca had enlisted in the Earth Defense Force, requesting assignment to the front lines. Her background as a navigation instructor made her valuable, and despite her age, they had accepted her immediately. She traced a finger over Susan's smiling face in the photograph. "They thought we were weak," she whispered. "They thought we would forgive this because we wanted peace." Rebecca placed the photo carefully in her duffel bag, next to her new uniform. They were wrong. The Krivax border outpost exploded in silent fire as Earth's first strike hit with surgical precision. No warning was given. No demands were made. The 5 warships that had harbored the attackers of the Compassion simply ceased to exist in a flash of light. Admiral Wright watched the footage with grim satisfaction from the bridge of the Retribution. Beside him, Lieutenant Davis studied the sensor readings. "No civilian casualties," she reported. "The mining colony 2 light minutes away wasn't even touched." "Good," Wright nodded. "We're not them." Colonel Freeman's team boarded the nearby Krivax station before the aliens could destroy their computers. The human soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their new armor deflecting the few shots the surprised Krivax managed to fire. Command center secure, Freeman reported over the comm. We've captured their central database. It's even better than we hoped, sir. We have confirmation that the hospital attack was part of a larger plan. They were testing our resolve. Wright's jaw tightened. Well, they have their answer now. The Krivax High Command was thrown into chaos by the sudden attack. They had expected negotiations, threats, perhaps small retaliatory strikes. Not this cold, efficient destruction. How did they penetrate our defenses so quickly? Demanded Supreme Commander Vrekta, his four arms gesturing wildly at the tactical display. Where is the rest of their fleet? His question was answered moments later when alarms blared throughout the command center. The impossible was happening. Human ships were appearing inside their defensive perimeter, bypassing the carefully planned barriers and minefields entirely. The U.S. Retribution led the charge, its new Phantom drive, allowing it to jump through space in ways the Krivax had thought impossible. One moment their sensors showed clear space, the next a human dreadnought appeared, weapons already firing. On the Retribution's bridge, Rebecca Miller guided the massive ship through the complex calculations required for the next jump. Her fingers flew over the navigation console, her focus absolute. Coordinates locked, she announced. Jump in 3, 2, 1. The stars blurred and shifted as the ship slipped between the normal boundaries of space. When they reappeared, they were directly above the Krivax military headquarters on Velis Prime. Send the message, Admiral Wright ordered. On every Krivax communication device on the planet, the same image appeared, footage from the Compassion security cameras showing the methodical execution of doctors, nurses, and patients. The message that followed was simple. We know who gave the order. Surrender Admiral Kreth now. The Krivax had never expected such a response. They had studied human history and seen how Earth's nations often debated for months before taking military action. They had calculated that humans valued peace too much to risk full-scale war over one ship, even a hospital vessel. They had been catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Davis approached Admiral Wright with a datapad. Sir, our intel network confirms the location of Admiral Kreth. He's fled to their sacred moon base. They thought we wouldn't attack a religious site. Wright's expression didn't change. Inform Colonel Freeman. Surgical strike only. Capture, not kill. We want him to stand trial. The Krivax attempted to counterattack using their superior numbers, but Earth's new shield technology, rushed into production by Dr. Green, proved impervious to their energy weapons. The alien ships fired again and again, only to watch their beams dissipate harmlessly against the human vessels. Impossible, whispered a Krivax weapons officer as his scans showed the shields actually growing stronger with each hit. They're absorbing our energy. Dr. Green smiled grimly as she monitored the shield performance from her station on Earth. 5 years of theoretical work brought to life in less than a week. Her sister would have been proud. As reports of Earth's victories spread, allied alien races began openly providing support. The Vorton fleet took up positions along Earth's colony worlds, freeing more human ships for the offensive. The Pellerin Concordat shared detailed maps of Krivax space that their traders had secretly compiled over decades. The Krivax High Command, which had dismissed humans as soft and unwilling to fight, now faced the full unleashed fury of a species that had once nearly destroyed itself in world wars before learning restraint. That restraint was now gone, replaced by cold, methodical vengeance. 2 weeks after the first strike, Admiral Wright stood on the bridge of the Retribution as it led the human fleet toward the Krivax homeworld. The main Krivax defense line had been left far behind, outflanked by the Phantom drive technology that allowed Earth ships to appear where the aliens least expected them. Status report, Wright ordered, his voice calm despite the enormity of what they were about to attempt. No human fleet had ever penetrated this deep into alien territory. "All ships in formation, sir," reported his executive officer. "The Krivak's home fleet is scrambling to intercept, but our projections show they won't reach us in time." Wright nodded. "And Engineer Howard's new detection system, online and functioning perfectly. We can now detect all cloaked Krivak's vessels within a light minute of our position." This had been the work of Sam Howard, a quiet engineer who had lost his brother on the Compassion. Working without sleep for days, he had discovered a way to detect the subtle space distortions created by Krivak's cloaking technology. Overnight, one of the aliens' greatest advantages had vanished. In the lead infiltration vessel, Rebecca Miller guided her small ship ahead of the main fleet. Behind her sat Colonel Freeman and his strike team, checking their weapons one final time. 5 minutes to insertion point, Rebecca announced, her hand steady on the controls. The small ship was designed to look like space debris, its energy signature masked to avoid detection. "Remember," Freeman told his team, "this is about justice, not revenge. We take prisoners when possible." His soldiers nodded grimly. They had all seen the footage from the Compassion. They all wanted blood, but they were professionals, and they would follow orders. On the Krivak's homeworld, panic spread as Earth's broadcasts reached every communication device. The human fleet had hacked their networks and was now showing the hospital massacre on all frequencies. Many Krivak civilians had never known the truth about the attack, their government having claimed it was a justified strike against a military target. Now they watched in horror as their soldiers executed doctors trying to protect their patients. They saw children in hospital beds gunned down without mercy. The carefully constructed propaganda of their military government began to crumble. "Shut it down," screamed Supreme Commander Vrekta in the War Council chamber. "Cut all communication networks." "It's too late," replied his technology minister. "They've infiltrated all our systems. We can't stop the broadcasts." Vrekta slammed all 4 of his fists onto the table. "Then we will meet these humans in battle and show them why the Krivak's empire has stood for 1,000 years. But even as he spoke, the chamber doors slid open. Colonel Freeman stood there, flanked by his strike team, their weapons trained on the War Council. "Supreme Commander Vrekta," Freeman said calmly, "you and your council are under arrest for war crimes against Earth and violations of the Interstellar Medical Neutrality Act." "How?" Vrekta gasped, unable to comprehend how humans had penetrated to the very heart of their government. Freeman didn't answer. Instead, he activated a small projector. The image of Dr. Alice Brown appeared, recorded during her final moments on the Compassion. "This is Dr. Alice Brown of the UNHS Compassion," her voice rang out clearly. "If anyone finds this recording, know that we tried to save everyone we could. Even now, with the aliens boarding our ship, my staff is trying to evacuate patients. I don't understand why they're doing this. We're doctors. We've treated their people too. If anyone survives, please remember that hate only breeds more hate. Even after this, we must find a way back to peace." The recording ended with the sound of weapons fire and the image of Dr. Brown turning to face something off camera, her expression determined rather than afraid. The War Council chamber fell silent. Several of the Krivak's officials lowered their heads, unable to meet the eyes of the human soldiers. Outside, in the streets of the Krivak's capital, the first protests had begun. Citizens who had believed their leaders' lies now demanded answers. Images of the Compassion's destruction appeared on public buildings, projected by hidden human devices. 1 month later, the captured Krivak's leaders stood before an interstellar tribunal. Representatives from 12 species sat in judgment, their faces grim as evidence of the hospital ship massacre was presented. Admiral Krev, the architect of the attack, showed no remorse. "The humans were becoming too influential in our sector," he declared. "The hospital ship was spreading their values to our people. It was a cultural invasion that needed to be stopped." His words were met with silence. Even his fellow Krivaks looked away in shame. The few survivors of the Compassion provided testimony that left many in the chamber weeping. A young nurse described hiding wounded children as the Krivax soldiers moved through the wards. A technician recounted Peter Garsh's sacrifice to save hundreds by manually sealing off the breached section. As the tribunal proceeded, the Krivax government collapsed. Moderate leaders, long silenced by the military, formed a provisional council and requested peace talks with Earth. Their first act was to offer unconditional surrender. Admiral Wright sat across from the new Krivax representatives, his face expressionless as they proposed terms. "You understand that Earth will require significant concessions," he said. "Your military will be dismantled. Your weapons factories closed." "We accept these terms," replied the lead Krivax diplomat. "We only ask that you spare our civilian population further suffering." Later, in private meetings with Earth's leaders, Wright argued for a full occupation of Krivax territory. "We can't risk this happening again," he insisted, pointing to casualty figures from the Compassion. Others pushed for a more merciful approach. "If we destroy their civilization, we become what we fought against," argued an influential senator. "We must find balance between justice and mercy." The debate raged for days until an unexpected voice tipped the scales. In orbit around the coordinates where the Compassion had been destroyed, a memorial service brought together representatives from Earth and its allies. A small shrine of floating lights marked the site, each one representing a life lost in the attack. Dr. William Jones, one of the few survivors who had managed to send the distress call, spoke to the assembled dignitaries. His face still bore scars from his narrow escape. "I watched good people die trying to save others," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. "I saw Dr. Brown try to reason with the attackers even as they raised their weapons. If we respond with the same hatred that drove this attack, we dishonor their memory. They were healers. Let us heal this wound between our species, not deepen it." His words reached billions watching across multiple worlds. In the days that followed, public opinion shifted. The final treaty included strict military restrictions and massive reparations, but also provisions for cultural exchange and joint scientific ventures. The Krivax would pay for their crimes, but their civilization would be given a chance to redeem itself. 6 months later, a new hospital ship was commissioned. The UNHS Reconciliation was twice the size of the Compassion, with enhanced defensive capabilities, but still marked clearly with the Red Cross of medical service. Its medical staff included both humans and, remarkably, a small contingent of Krivax doctors who had opposed their government's actions. Captain Lisa Martinez, promoted after her brave defense of the Compassion's evacuation, stood on the bridge of the new vessel. She had insisted on taking this command despite offers of more prestigious military positions. From the observation deck, she watched as the first patients were brought aboard. A mix of species including human and Krivax children injured in a mining accident on a border world. "Captain," called her first officer, "all patients are aboard. Medical teams report ready status." Lisa nodded. "Take us out, Mr. Peterson. Standard speed." As the Reconciliation moved away from the station, Lisa thought about her friends lost on the Compassion. They would have approved of this new beginning. A small Krivax child looked up as she passed through the pediatric ward during her rounds. Instead of fear, his eyes showed only gratitude as a human doctor adjusted his treatment. In that moment, Lisa understood what Dr. Brown had meant in her final message. Earth's greatest victory hadn't come from its military might, impressive as that had been. It had come from the harder path of showing mercy after delivering justice, proving that humanity's true strength lay in its capacity for both.